I hope everybody can hear me. The connection looks good. Um, so this will not be a full tutorial. This will be just slides presentation. I did upload it into the GitHub repository, so it's there if you want to look at it. This talk will be about reproducible science and data management. And that is the background is a picture I took yesterday while going on a hike for my wife's birthday. We're out in Western Massachusetts right now, and that's the Connecticut River you see going under there. So I am presenting to you from my in-laws' house, which has been an exciting adventure for the week. A little bit about me. So first and foremost, I am a surfer. I've surfed for 30 years, always in the water. I love everything about the water. And so that got me into oceanography. I didn't realize it was a science. And I went to Humboldt State University and I realized that you could do oceanography and you could do math with the ocean. And it was kind of one of those glass breaking moments in my educational path. And so I took that into a master's at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Studies, looking at sediment transport in the upper Chesapeake Bay. And that was actually the results on the right-hand side from my modeling experiment, which I did. And while I was, when I finished my undergraduate and I was doing my master's, I actually have been working at various data centers and repositories. And that's the perspective that I'm bringing to all of you is maybe not so much of the oceanography, but more of working at all of these data centers and actually seeing a lot of the stuff that happens within the repositories and within national centers and trying to give some tidbits, some pointers. And there's a million links in this presentation. And the point of this is just to give you some background and some information on where to go to look for resources to do better reproducible science, to share your data, to make sure that your code is reusable and all of those really good things. So my background is from, I worked at the National Centers for Environmental Information, which is NOAA's long-term archive for environmental data. So a lot of metadata and preservation. And then I worked at Bico Demo doing biological data management, biological and chemical oceanography data management. And that's kind of your anything and everything under the sun that was ever collected in the water. And then my current position is working at IUSE, where we're doing a lot more the real-time coastal observations and things like that. And so through my master's experience of doing this model, we had this idea of we wanted to look at sediment transport in the upper Chesapeake Bay. And there was this really cool new formulation for flow of sediment through vegetation. And so my advisors and I said, oh, this is a really cool model and we want to apply it to our region. And so, of course, I had to do all the research and figure it out. And I had to basically become a computer science major just to get the thing up and running before I could actually apply it to my region and then do all of my scientific analysis. And so the reproducibility of what it was that they created in the beginning was really difficult. And I spent most of my master's just getting this darn model running. And I spent about a month actually doing the analysis and doing my defense process. So the reproducibility part of it is definitely key when it comes to all of this. And so that's just my little tidbit of how I've experienced, and I'm sure everybody else has had similar experiences, whether it be with models or whether it be with just observations. If you take a bottle, how do you process it? Are you doing it the same as everybody else? And those kinds of things. So just these aren't, I'm not going to quiz anybody, don't worry, but these are kind of rhetorical questions to see, have you thought about what a repository is? And these are all of the different parts that are very integral to reproducible science, as well as data management and ensuring your observations are reusable and preserved for the long term. So somebody can come back in 50 years and reuse your information and use it with the level of understanding that they need to have in order to use it correctly. So tools that we've been learning about through the OceanHackWeek, including Git, doing branches with Git, where you can have your own separate little thing that you can tinker with and then put it back into a main repository. How do you build a package in Python? And those kinds of things. And I think this this cartoon is one of my favorites because there's all these standards that are out there, and so let's let's do something to bring all the standards together, and now we have 15 standards. So it's just this ever-growing thing. So let's try to reuse the stuff that's already existing out there, and try to not invent new things. And one of the things that I hope everybody can come with this is there's already a lot of work being done in data management and in code sharing, and so try to do some research beforehand and see what exists out in the world, because a lot of people have already been doing a lot of work in these realms. So don't go reinventing the wheel, because most likely it's already being worked on in some realm or another. And so that brings me to the data steward salad. So these are all of the different groups, and this is just a subset of them that are working on data management, they're working on software management, they're working on anything and everything that has to do with oceanographic data and beyond. One of the ones that I do want to highlight is the Earth Science Information Partners, which is ESIP, and that's basically this community of data managers, of scientists that get together to try to figure out, what's the appropriate controlled vocabulary for oceanographic observations, or what's a good primer for biological data standards that we can share with up and coming data scientists and things like that. So a lot of these groups are already doing a lot of work, and so I put all the links are in there, and just feel free, if you have questions or anything, take a look at a lot of the work that's going on there. And again, just don't reinvent the wheel is what we want to do. So it gets into repeatability, replicability, and reproducibility. And so when we do a scientific experiment, we want to make sure that we can repeat it. The same team has the same setup, so it's the same team using the same parameters, the same equipment in the same lab. And then we want to be able to replicate that, use a different team, but maybe in the same lab using all of the same materials. But then we also want to be able to reproduce it, maybe at a different lab with different people with different materials, but coming up with the same solutions. And so there's various methods to going about doing that. And one of the ways to do that is by making sure that the previous information is actually accessible, findable, and to do that, we can use the FAIR principles, which is making data easier to use. They provide guidelines on how to make your data and your code findable and accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So how do we discover the observations that were made? I know there was a lot of questions that were going around Slack of how do I find what I want to do this kind of a project, how do I find that data? And that's one of the key principles in this these FAIR guidelines. And then how do we make it accessible? How do we put the data on the internet, and how do we make it accessible in formats that are interoperable? How could we compare temperature from one sensor to another sensor? How do we make sure that the units are the same, and we can actually do this interoperability? We can do some analysis that compares all of these different things. And then how do we ensure that the observations are actually reusable? I know with a lot of biological observations, the methods are really important. You could have the same observations, but the means by which your methods were done to collect that data can mean that the data actually aren't intercomparable. So we need to have that information about how the observations were made in order to ensure that it's reusable in 50, 75 years. And so again, their groups are dedicated to doing these kinds of efforts. And most of the time, if you are funded, your funding will have a requirement to work with a data center, a data repository, or something of the like. And so these data centers are actually paid to make your data available. So while there might be some caveats to submitting to certain data centers, most of them are always available to talk to give you advice. If you want to submit data there and you might not be the right place, they will more than likely point you in the right direction. So feel free to always reach out and ask questions about where should I submit my data, what should I do with my data, because these groups are always there and they're always willing to help. And if you work with the data centers from the beginning, when you're coming up with your proposal for your research and you start working with the data centers, then that will make your life much easier as you go down the research data lifecycle. So they can give you advice on where to submit. They can give you advice on what kind of formats you should be using for your data. And in some cases, if you use the formats that they recommend, there's tools that are available that will make a lot of your life easier. And so now we're getting to a point where if you're starting to publish a paper, you're getting you're trying to submit a paper, trying to get it published, the publishers are requiring you to submit to certain repository or to a repository to make sure your data is available. And so if you've already had that conversation with your repositories, with your data centers, then getting to that when you're writing a publication and now you have that requirement thrown down upon you, it's much easier to satisfy that and get your paper out the door much quicker instead of, the day of publication. I know working out some data centers, we get an email saying, I'm trying to publish this paper right now. And we're like, well, it's going to take us a couple of weeks to actually get to your data set because there's a lot of things we need to do to get this up to par to be so that the data is aligning with FAIR principles and is properly documented for reuse in the future. So the one thing is, get in contact with your data centers early and often and make sure you have a fluent conversation with them, because it also gives them the heads up as if you're working with some massive data set, then and that's part of you're required to submit to them, then they have to figure out mechanisms for dealing with something that they might not have dealt with before. So it works both ways. Now the repositories are aware of something that might be coming down the line in the next couple of years, and you can have an interactive, engaging conversation on both sides. And then we get to methods. And so there are repositories where you can actually put in your the methods that you're using. And one of the big ones that we have is the Ocean Best Practices Systems. And this is a repository that'll actually give you a digital object identifier for manuals and handbooks. So if you have specific procedures, laboratory procedures, anything like that, then you can deposit it here and you can actually reference it in your paper using a DOI, and then that's usable. And it could also be usable to, through globally, since this is UNESCO and an IOC project, it's now internationally agreed upon methods and things like that. So this is really an important part in connecting that entire data lifecycle is getting your methods, whether they're computational methods, whether they're laboratory methods, is getting that out and getting it shared and into the open, because we want to ensure that the science that you're doing is actually is shared, is open, and it's reproducible. And other people, you don't have to spend the 2 years that I did in being a computer scientist to get all my compilers and everything running in order to reproduce your science. And then there's another system called protocols.io. I think there might be a fee involved, but this is just kind of a mention that there are other platforms that are available that are might have some pros and cons with them, but just as an additional reference for you. Yeah, reproducible software. So this is, I have to give a shout out. Sorry, I forgot to do it at the beginning. These slides were heavily borrowed from last year's presentation by Joseph Gum. And so a lot of this is opinionated practices on how reproducible software, what the actions that we can take. But so there's a lot of different opinions. I guess I'll just say that. And so why do we want to go through the effort to ensure that our code, our processes are actually reproducible? And one of them is for faster deployment of code. If it's understandable and everything is lined up correctly, then somebody can pick it up, deploy it easily. It's much faster, a lot less work is needed. And it also makes it easier to understand. So if your code isn't just a bunch of text all cobbled together, it's actually in a readable form, that there's certain spacings and certain line formattings, then it's easier to understand as well. It's more logical to read through what's actually happening instead of, I know I've looked through some of my advisors code, and sometimes it's a little difficult to understand what's actually happening. So it helps with it helps being able to reproduce what it is they were actually doing. And it also facilitates extending the code. So if you want to add on something to what's been done before. And then the one thing that I like to stress is when you're writing code, you're actually providing provenance for what you're doing for your data. And the provenance is tracking the historical translation of, you went from your raw data and now you have documentation for, you have the physical documentation of what you did to that data to come up with the results that you have. And I think that's a really, really valuable thing. And I think that really lends itself to this reproducibility. And then it also gives you good and warm, fuzzy feelings about it's good and it's good for you and the community. And now different different groups are coming out with guidance on how should we be sharing our code, how should we be documenting it, how should we be ensuring reproducibility within the scientific publication process. And so AGU and AMS have some guidance and have some policies, and this is becoming a larger and larger topic within the publication community on getting code and getting all these things shared with the community. And then, yeah, so again, reiterating the reproducibility of, you want it to be readable. If you come back to your code with a year later, 2 years later, and you look at it and you have no idea what you want, well, that doesn't really help very much if someone's trying to recreate your work. And then there's also the different dependencies and the installs. So can somebody come in and did you use an unsupported package that might not exist anymore? Did you use something that's licensed and available through multiple pathways? That lends itself to, can the code actually be executed? Whether or not you have the code is one thing, but can you actually execute it? Can you run it? And then that leads into the code brittleness. And so there have been some surveys, some looking at, what do people in the community think about software and data? What were some of the inputs? And really everybody agrees that, code and software should be available. It should be out. It should be used. But the technicalities of how do we go about doing that is where everything kind of runs into each other. And so a lot of the things we try to do is just educate, just show that, these resources exist and they're out there, and it's it might look like a crazy mess of things, but there's actually a lot of activity and a lot of good resources that are available. And so a lot of the questions have been thought about, and now we're getting into, requirements by journals and funding bodies, and they're actually providing guidance and tutorials on how to go about sharing information and things like this. And so what are some of the decisions that the oceanographic community have come into? And this is by no means a comprehensive list of things. These are some of the topics that I've run across through my experiences at different repositories and data centers, but by no means is this the list that everybody uses. There is, specific guidance on formats like NetCDF. So there's the climate and forecast conventions for NetCDF, which tells you how to construct your NetCDF file and how to have some documentation to ensure it's interoperable. And then there's an extension to that for the attribute conventions for dataset discovery, or ACDD, which explains how to write metadata in a NetCDF file and what to put in which places to ensure that the data is actually discoverable. So when you do those queries on, say, like an ERDAP server and you're looking for keywords, a lot of those keywords are because they're following the attribute conventions for dataset discovery. And then there's groups that have done templates based on CF and ACDD to make it a little bit easier for data providers or for people to reformat their data into NetCDF. So NCEI has templates for each of the feature types within CF, and then IUSE has a metadata profile, and these are just little flavors of how to implement those different standards. And there's plenty more out there. Those are just the two that I highlight here. And then we get into occurrence and environmental observations. There's the Darwin Core Standard, genomics has mixes, and there's contingency tables in the biome format. And then there's descriptive metadata. And so if you go to your repository and you say, do you guys produce ISO 19115-2, you will get a gold star. I can guarantee it. Everybody will be happy about that. But I just wanted to mention these in the sense that this is when you fill out a Word document or you fill out an online form for submitting your data, what you're doing is you're populating these metadata forms that ensure you can discover and you can find and that the data are interoperable. So these are just quick mentions to let you know what they are, so they won't sound Greek when you're working with a repository. And then we get in the wild world of standard vocabularies. And so standard vocabularies are regulated vocabularies with strict definitions. So there's a community that comes together and says, this is what we want to call seawater temperature. And these are the units that are associated with seawater temperature. And there's a committee that will go through and review what that proposal is, what the definition of that term is, and what the units are, and then it will be published in some table using some web-enabled services, hopefully, and that really facilitates a lot of this interoperability amongst different data sets. So you can get temperature from a satellite and you can compare it to temperature from a buoy, and that's all because you're using these standard vocabularies. And so there's a couple groups that are managing these, and there's a lot of different vocabularies out there. And so this is one of the other plugs I'll say is don't invent your own vocabulary. Try to use something that exists out in the community. One of them more for the physical parameters, although they are starting to do biological parameters, is climate and forecast. So they do the net CDF part, but then they also have their own standard name table. So sometimes there's a little bit of confusion there, but it's the same body that manages both of those. And then a really good resource if you're just looking for vocabularies is the NERC vocabulary server. And what this is a collection of vocabularies. And so they have the climate and forecast vocabularies within that, but then they also have other things like NASA has a global change master directory vocabulary that's inside of NERC as well. So they're kind of, I think of them as more of an aggregator, but they also have their own independent vocabularies for some of the things that they need them for. So that's a really good resource if you're just trying to look for what should I call something. I recommend starting there because you will probably end up at CF or at the appropriate vocabulary that way. And then there's taxonomy. The WORMS is the World Registry for Marine Science, marine species. Sorry about that. And that's they have an AFIA ID, which is a unique identifier for each of the terms, and then that's a resolvable URI, I believe. I don't know if it's it's a URI. That's a unique identifier for each of the species, and it'll give the entire taxonomy of that species. And so if you are dealing with that kind of information, it's highly recommended to use WORMS, as the repository that you probably will work with will require you to use that. And then if it's not marine, then there's ITIS, but marine is always WORMS. And then there's different strategies for environments and running environments. And Pangeo is a really interesting effort in creating a standardized environment to run code. So, and I'm not an expert in it. I think Philippe could give more insight into this, but it basically gives you a standardized environment that you can share, you can work in, and then you can share your information amongst colleagues, and everybody has the available packages that they need to use to run the code that you're running. And then there's various tools that are out there, and of course I highlighted the IUSE ones because those are who are writing my check right now, but there's a lot of different tools that are out there within the oceanographic community, and all of you are using different tools as of now using your projects. But the ones I wanted to highlight is the IUSE QC, which is the implementation of the quality assurance for real-time oceanographic data. And so that allows you to QC real-time observations, and we provide some specifications for how to do those QCs. And what it does is it allows others to use the same quality control on similar types of observations. So there's consistency across different platforms. And then the compliance checker is, it allows you to check a netcdf file against the various conventions that are out there. So if you wanted to create your own netcdf file and you want it to align with certain certain standards, then you can use the compliance checker to test your file, and it'll tell you what you're missing, what might be wrong. And then there's tools like ERDAPI, which is Python package that allows you to interact with ERDAP servers. And so if all of that is too much and you just want to know, I have a data table, what should I do with it? How do I need to organize this table of information that I have? The bare essentials that I always recommend is to look at tidy data. I know this is more of an R thing, but I really like the philosophy there on how to organize a table of data. And it might seem kind of silly, but you'd be surprised at some of the stuff that I've seen and the interesting ways that people present their data. And so their recommendation is variables are in columns, observations are in rows. So if it's a time series, you have temperature, salinity, oxygen in each column, and then your rows are the each individual time observation. And if you have dates, which hopefully you do, you're following the ISO 8601 for dates. And I give in the template there because dates are always the most difficult thing for a data center to handle, because they're so many different ways, so many different formats, and you'd be surprised how many times we're missing the time zone information. And if we don't have the time zone information, we can't appropriately identify when that actual observation was made. So always include the time zone information. And then latitudes and longitudes and decimal degrees. Hopefully, if you know the datum is in WGS, if 84. If you don't know that, or if it's not in WGS 84, document that it's in a different datum so that somebody down the road knows that you're not in the same datum. And then the last part is don't embed important information in column headers. So this example is a little wonky, but I think it shows that, you know, if you have year information in the header, how are you going to be able to extract that information and use it later on in this data's life cycle? And I've seen this with sediment cores. I've seen this with various types of observations where, you know, depths are embedded into the header, and then we have to go in and extract those out because that's actually useful information that somebody might want to use later in the data life cycle. And then, so now getting back to code, how do we standardize our coding practices? And there's some opinionated guidelines through the PEP 20, and that's basically, you know, this is the way we are doing things. But the more and more people that follow the opinionated practices, the easier it is to share, because more and more people understand what those practices are and can read it more easily. And there's been some recent sharing of you know, rules and guidelines on writing and sharing computational analysis in Jupyter notebooks. I thought that was a really interesting link, and it gives you some good information on how to write a Jupyter notebook, but how to put prose in it and how to kind of write a narrative while you have your code pieces inside of it. And so the more and more that we have these little tidbits of information, the documentation embedded within our code, the more and more useful it is to the rest of the community once later on down the road. And so there are tools that are available to help align with some of these recommendations. And there's also, you know, Git and GitHub and sharing things through through cloud technologies, and then using NetCDF and things like that. And so we get into working environments, and this really helps with installing and setting up an environment to run code. So this tells you what are the packages that I need to have to make this bit of code run. And it makes it easier to prevent unforeseen mixing of, you know, I use this version of this package versus this version of this package, and they're not compatible between the two or something like that. So if we have working environments, we're allowed to, we have the reproducibility, we're ensuring reproducibility of our code. And you could do that through package managers like Conda and Conda Forge, which allows for easier installation of dependencies and environments. And then Python has pip for installing packages as well. And then you can create virtual environments using Conda, and then you can wrap everything together into tools like Docker, which actually gives you the base environment that everything can be run in, as well as your Conda environment and your Python and all of your packages inside of there, so it can be run on basically machine independence. And so some of the tools for running notebooks online include Binder. You can link that through GitHub. And then there's also, it's not really recent, but it has, it's definitely taken a surge recently. It is the Google Colab. And this is really nice because you can do it straight from Google Drive, which I know a lot of people use. And that allows you to basically run a Jupyter notebook on through this service. While it doesn't have all of the, it doesn't allow you to build an environment like Binder will. Binder, you can give it an environment file and it'll actually build out and install the packages you need. Google Colab has certain built-in packages available, and then you can do a pip install within that and run some additional packages if they're available that way through Google Colab. So I've been using that as a quick and easy way to share code and share and to allow other people to execute the code that I was running. And so I've been doing that as kind of demos in the middle of a working session or something. Let's pull it up and let's just run through this really quick. So that's been a nice tool that's available. And so again, yeah, it allows others to experiment with your code. And then you can make DOI notebooks runnable by using these links off to Binder and Google Colab. And so everybody knows Git and GitHub, and they're all friendly with it now after halfway through the OceanHackWeek. So I don't know if I need to go into all the details, but one thing I would say is that this cartoon off on the right is actually the reason that I started using Git to manage my thesis paper. So it was a Word document. It wasn't anything fancy, but I used a Git repository to manage all my revisions and all my updates to it because of this PhD comic. And it was really nice because there were times where I would meet with my committee and we'd talk about something, and then they'd be like, well, we should revert it back to that. And then I could go through my Git history and actually revert it. And so I thought Git was only for code. I thought that's the only thing, or GitHub was only for code, and that was the only use for it. But it's actually, there's a lot more use for it even outside of code. And there's been some recent guidance on like how to share standards and how to share data standards using GitHub and using these things, because they encourage collaboration and they also encourage transparency in the conversations that you're having. And so you could document where you might have problems with your code, but then you can also document where there might be a differing of opinions for how things might be done. So yeah, that was my little insight into that part. And so GitHub is only one place. There's plenty of other places that you can actually store, have revision control systems. And so the formatting of your code, so if there are tools, I think these are, I don't know if these are available for R, but I know they're available in Python. And what these tools do is they'll take your code and they'll actually reformat it so it's a little bit more understandable and more readable. And so you can run a bit of code through isort or through back. And this is an example of taking one thing that's a really long string and then breaking it down. And it's much more easy to identify what you're actually doing within the code. And then it's much more easy actually to identify what parts of the code might be wrong, where you might be messing up some formatting or some syntax. So, so those are really great resources to use. And then as you're writing code, always add comments, always add documentation. And one of the things that is really neat and really useful is doc strings for being able to write documentation in your Python scripts. And one of the cool things is you can use tools like Sphinx to actually take that documentation and extract it out and create a PDF or a text or an HTML, and actually be able to have it in a more independent way instead of inside of your code. And then you can use things like Read the Docs to host it actually online for free, so it's even more shareable. And then you can get into tools like using Jupyter Book, where you can take a collection of Jupyter notebooks and actually share those out as a book and write it and be able to print those out as PDFs. You can link them off into binders so they're executable, they're runnable in cloud infrastructure. And then you can link it into GitHub Pages, which allows you to serve a web page from your GitHub repository and then use GitHub Actions to publish your book. So you basically have all of these free services linked in through your GitHub and through your repository that allows you to share all of this information. So it's really facilitating that reusability and that sharing of information. And licensing code and data. Yeah, there's a lot about licensing for software. I think the MIT and BSD are recommended. And then for data there's still a lot of I don't know, conversations going on, at least within the NOAA landscape, on data licensing and the implications of data licensing. And so just be aware that there are licensing implications if you apply a license to data. And again, talk to your repository, talk to your funder, see what their recommendations are, because depending on what license you apply limits what you might be able to do, or it expands what you might be able to do in the future. So just keep an eye out for licenses. And then digital object identifiers. So DOIs are, they're just like with papers. They're unique identifiers for your paper, for your entity, and it ensures a resolvable landing page to find your information, to find that piece of research or that paper. Your institution might be able to give you DOIs, but always, again, talk to your funder first. So you can make DOIs for your code there's a connection between GitHub and Zenodo. So if you have a package, so when I did my research, I had my initialization scripts for how I created all my initial files for my model, and in a GitHub repository, and I actually pushed that through Zenodo and got a DOI for it, which I referenced in my publication. So you can use those DOIs for then referencing too, and it will have all of your code and all of the information in there. And then there's extensions onto that, like Code Meta, which allow you to write metadata about your software. So we're not only talking about findable, accessible, interoperable data, but we're also talking about findable, accessible, interoperable software. So writing metadata and information about the software itself. And then you can, again, get DOIs for your data, but first and foremost, talk to your funder, talk to your repository. Most likely they have a pathway for you to go about doing that. And if they don't, they will recommend a pathway to do it. You might be able to talk to your local institutional repositories. They might be able to mint DOIs for you. But again, talk to your funder first. And as a last ditch effort, if you have nowhere to go, Zenodo will take data, and there is a mechanism for getting a DOI on data that way. And then, yeah, so if you get DOIs, there's various citation tools out there for helping you cite code and cite software. At the bottom in the bold, I actually put in, this is the recommended citation for a software package from the Earth Science Information Partners software and service citation. And so once you get a DOI, you can really do a lot with it. And so where does this lead us? This leads us to hopefully the future of scientific papers, the executable paper, where Jane has a paper, or it has written a paper based on her experiments, and now she wants to share it. She wants to make sure somebody else can go and redo it. So they go ahead, they put it in the Jupyter notebook, where they mix the code, they mix some narrative that describes what's happening with the code, links off to source the data. Hopefully the data is in a fair repository where it's accessible and you can actually use web services to pull the data in. And then you go ahead and you can publish those Jupyter notebooks, and you can use things again like GitHub, like we talked about, and then make them interactive and useful, share, reusable through tools like Binder, which will configure, use the notebook and the resources, bring it all together. And then you can use tools like Docker to ensure that the environment and everything else is all contained within that one bucket. And now anybody and everybody can pick up that experiment, pick up that code, and actually reuse it across the world. So this is something that I know there's been within AGU. There's a paper that they've been working on publishing that's actually using a Jupyter notebook as a publication. So they've been looking at using tools like this as mechanisms for being able to actually publish in DOI an interactive executable paper. And this is a really, really cool place that we're going. And so that's all I had. I know I was the last one, so I wanted to say thank you everybody for coming to OceanHackWeek. And if you have any questions or anything, I know that was a lot of information that I just brain barfed on everybody, but feel free to reach out to me, reach out to your repositories. I know Steve Diggs is participating here and he can definitely help you out too, so reach out to him. And yeah, I hope you all had a great week, and yeah, thank you all. Any questions?
Thanks, Matt. That was great. There are no questions, but there are lots and lots of ongoing chat and conversation and other links and resources going on in the tutorials channel related to everything that you were saying as you were going through. So there's a lot going on there. There's also an interesting conversation that Nick started up about encountering cases where data or code should not be made open because of privacy concerns.
Right.